So in 1966, Neil Young will join this band called the Minor Birds. Do you know who their frontman was?
I'm Rick James. That's who the Minor Birds. Do Minor Birds talk, by the way?
I don't know.
I think Minor Birds talk.
Oh, like a parakeet?
Yeah.
Or not a parakeet. A parrot. A parakeet does not talk.
See, no, but I think Minor Birds do. And as a kid, there was a Minor Bird, I forget where the store was, and it used to make this noise and go, bit-a-bee, bit-a-bee. And my whole life, without even knowing it, I've called my big sister Bethaby.
Oh.
Like one of those things.
Because of the Minor Bird.
Because of the Minor Bird, yeah.
What do you know?
And it has nothing to do with super freak Rick James at all, right?
Well, shout out to Rick James here. And, they get a record deal with Motown, right?
They get a record deal with Motown, guys. Neil Young and Rick James were in a band, and they got a record deal with Motown. And guess what happened? Rick James gets arrested. So just foreshadowing to him getting arrested later in his career, this is him getting arrested for being AWOL. He was a Navy Reserve. So that's it. The band's over. So what would you and I do if our singer, basically got arrested? We would pawn everything we own, all our instruments, and then we would buy a Pontiac hearse so we could drive to L.A. for our dreams to come true.
That's what Neil Young and bass player Bruce Palmer actually did.
Yeah.
So let's stop here for just a second. This is the magical aura around a lot of the Neil Young story. I mean, we're in the mid-'60s, and we've already casually name-dropped like half a dozen major players in this tale. This guy seems to show up in the right place at the right time a lot. And so this is what happens after he drives that hearse to L.A.
Oh, yeah. So the right place, right time. So Bruce and Neil are driving down Sunset Boulevard one day, and Neil's like, wait, is that Stephen Stills? And it is. So Stephen Stills is hanging out with this guy, Richard Furay?
Richie Furay.
Richie Furay, sorry. And this chance encounter gets them together, and then before you know it, they start this band you might know that's called Buffalo Springfield.
We've actually gotten some letters about Richie Furay, and he's one of these background guys that has a huge influence in rock music and doesn't get talked about a whole lot. But yeah, they create this Buffalo Springfield band. They have some success, but they disintegrate pretty quickly. 3 albums, really only the first one has the organic story. The rest of them become fragmented pastiches as the band's members start not getting along.
And the real part of the strain, really, it might be, this is my opinion or real fact, I don't know, but this is what I think it really is that Neil Young isn't big on perfection. I think maybe that should be clear to everybody.
Okay.
But Stephen Stills and Buffalo Springfield are deliberate, so those two things don't fit.
Yeah, he's a little jammy. I mean, there's a reason that a lot of jam music will kind of pay homage to Neil Young. I think he kind of brings that ethos into the mainstream for people. Long story short, Neil goes solo. Of course, he will later rejoin Stephen Stills and demand title billing with Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young, and he will become known alongside several different bands that he puts together and breaks apart over the years, the most famous one being Crazy Horse.
Yeah.
But once you get to the 70s, Neil Young is doing things his way.
Yeah, and the best example of that is Harvest, is that album. If you know very little about...
It's one of the Neil Young albums I really liked. I'm not huge on Neil Young, but I do own a copy of Harvest. I feel like that's a must-have.
And if you don't know much about Neil Young, you probably know that record, the 4th record.
Yeah, and parts of it were recorded basically almost on a whim. He's in Nashville to be on the Johnny Cash show, and the studio owner takes him to breakfast and says, you should record your album at my place. And Neil's like, cool. How about today?
Yeah, right.
How about tonight?
Yeah.
Later, he has arguments about how it will be recorded and what will be on it. He does a bunch of weird stuff to it, stuff that always confused me as a young listener when I came to it. For instance, he puts a live track in the middle of it, and 2 tracks have the London Symphony Orchestra on them.
Which on Music Row in Nashville is probably pretty weird, But... it then becomes the best-selling record of 1972, and it's like he's a sellout. He gets totally freaked out with the success.
Yeah, I don't think he ever plans for this to happen.
Never.
He's so singular in just sort of the way he approaches life and his art that I don't think it occurred to him that people might like it.
Yeah, and like a band like Zeppelin, critics hated Zeppelin. The people loved it. Critics didn't like Harvest, but the people certainly did. It's one example of this attitude we start to see with Neil that's a little bit of the middle finger, this obtuseness, a daring way to destroy his own success and set the stage for what we'll see a decade later when he decides to get to the heart of the story that we're talking about.
Now, we've used this word prolific to describe him. Man, in the next 10 years, he has a new record every single calendar year.
Yeah, it's true. It's fascinating because during this period, he becomes like a pillar of folk and country, like at the same time. Because he's in The Last Waltz, and he's with Joni Mitchell alongside Bob Dylan. But eventually, by the end of the decade, he embraces sort of this punk like pedigree that Johnny Rotten will cover one of his songs in a radio performance.
Fun fact, the release of Martin Scorsese's movie The Last Waltz concert was delayed while Scorsese unwillingly re-edited it to obscure the lump of cocaine that was clearly visible hanging from Neil Young's nose during his performance of Helpless.
I had to look this up and then understand what the word cocaine face was. But really, if you have never seen The Last Waltz, or if you have, take a look at The Last Waltz and watch Neil through that. He's just really extremely happy during that song.
I'm going to cut that line again. Fun fact, the release of Martin Scorsese's Last Waltz was actually delayed because Scorsese had to go back and re-edit the scene where Neil Young is singing Helpless because there's cocaine coming out of his nose.
Yes. If none of you are familiar with the word cocaine face, watch The Last Waltz and watch the song Helpless and look at Neil Young. He looks way really happy to be there.
Back to punk, though. Remember how I mentioned this sci-fi comedy that Neil Young made under another name?
Yeah.
You know who his main collaborators were on that film?
I do.
The band Devo.
Yeah, that's true. So if you want to hear nutty, do my own thing kind of thing, Neil Young spends $3 million of his own money on this production. And like today money, it's almost $12 million.
Oh, my God. As this process is going on, he also sets out on this lengthy Russ Never Sleeps tour in which he plays a bunch of the new material. Each show is like half solo and then half Crazy Horse.
Yeah.
And when Crazy Horse comes out, it gets really loud. So it's well documented that this tour and the subsequent album and film that get made about it, there are these very, very early touch points for the grunge movement. Like, we kind of don't get Nirvana if we don't have Neil Young, and that's why he's important. We don't really get Pearl Jam unless we have Neil Young. Now, of course, this all becomes circular when Neil Young and Pearl Jam and Crazy Horse will create music together, right? And it's all because of how Neil uses distortion on guitars. The shining example of this is a song you probably know, and I think we both really like, Hey, Hey, My, Into the Black.